Dr. Jack Kruse joins the podcast again for a second time, and we want to dive in and understand his thoughts between centralization and decentralization. So, I come from the point of being involved in agriculture, very, very passionate about regenerative agriculture, specifically as I believe that that's how we tie nature practices into how we produce our food. With that, my son was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer when he's 5, now cancer-free. We're still just trying to learn and apply. And so got Jack back on to see what's going on in El Salvador, how he's involved, and he has plenty of thoughts, plenty of opinions. The audio's a little bit windy. He's outside on his mountain overlooking the Pacific Ocean. So there's a lot to unravel in this conversation. Dr. Jack Kruse joining the Sowing Prosperity podcast for the second time. I want to start by saying that you have absolutely changed my life. There is no question about that. I don't know if you remember, I asked you, what can I do for my son who was overcoming stage 4 cancer? And you said stay away from the devices and stuff, and you worry about him if he has a job on computers, but get a tan on his back. And so that I didn't understand even a little bit, dove in, and you have opened me up to a whole new world, to say the least. With that said, my day job, I own a farmer's market in central Arkansas, and so the agricultural system coupled with health and just trying to do things right led me to trying to understand what happened in the 70s that got us so wrong. And you're laying out New Orleans and the issues with, say, Alton Oshner and Dr. Mary's Monkey, all of that led me down looking at Earl Butts and the front man of what happened. So I just wanted to talk to you about what's going on in El Salvador. How does it look for nature to come back into agriculture in a decentralizing country? And just give you the floor, my friend, to go in any direction you want.
Well, I would argue that it didn't start in the 70s. The problem where we went off the rails started with General Kruse and the Manhattan Project. And that's when the industrial military complex realized how powerful science could be, especially if they could control it. And unfortunately, at every step from the Manhattan Project up until 2024, that mindset is still present. Like many people don't even understand through COVID that the Department of Defense, not Big Pharma, was the distributor for the jab. So you have to realize Big Pharma is like the drug dealer for the industrial military complex. I think when you actually realize that that's a true statement and you understand truly what's going on, you begin to understand that this story goes, way, way far back for a long period of time. And the implications, the collateral effects are massive. They're not small, they're big. When you bring food into it, for example, because I know you're big into that, what you need to understand is the history of food. Like Bobby Kennedy's tried to lay that out. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think he's done a good job, but I try to make it even simpler for people to understand. The simple issue is what's going on in Europe right now is governments are trying to steal farmland and do the same thing that we did in the United States to farmers in the 60s and 70s. And what did we do? We centralized and industrialized the farm industry in the United States. Why was that successful? Because before there was big tech, before there was the Industrial Revolution, America was based around the farms. That story started in 1803 when we basically got the Louisiana Purchase for $12 million from Napoleon. And people don't even know our own history. Why was that the most successful agricultural buy ever? Napoleon was told by the people in France that the land was useless. So therefore, when he was fighting a war, he said, I'm going to sell it for $12 million. The irony of this story is Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the people that penned our founding documents, realized that purchasing the Louisiana Purchase for $12 million was an unconstitutional act, but it was such a good deal, he couldn't turn it down. And he convinced people in the United States soon after the Constitution is out there to pull the trigger. And the first thing he did was a stroke of genius. He actually hired Lewis and Clark to go out and study the topography of the land. And within 2 weeks of being out there, the report came back to Thomas Jefferson that they found aquifers in Louisiana and Texas. And they felt bare minimum that this plot of land that they bought, if we can somehow get the water from the ground, we could probably turn this into the biggest farmland in all the 13 colonies. So from that standpoint, the country would be self-sustainable from that point. And that's when Jefferson realized it was a good deal. So you know the story since you live in Arkansas because you are part of the Louisiana Purchase. That became the breadbasket of not just the 13 colonies, but the rest of the world. We became an agricultural power overnight. And that set the stage for, future events. The problem is when we retooled the economy at the turn of the 20th century, we were moving to an industrial revolution. Farmers became superfluous to the people in power. And when it was really magnified was probably in the elections that occurred later in the 20th century. I would say post JFK, probably Lyndon Baines Johnson and Nixon is when food prices became an actual issue in the election. And people don't even know how we got the dietary pyramid, but it was because of a senator and Nixon. They wanted to eliminate food ever being an option in an election. So they wanted cheap food. So what did we do? We came up with this dietary pyramid that if you eat like it, you'll look like a pyramid. But they made all cheap foodstuffs. And then what was the next step? Companies in the Midwest like ADM and Cargill, I'm just throwing a couple names out there, even John Deere, they became centralized. And basically we went from mom and pop farms to these big industrial food cooperatives, and who got fucked in the whole situation, which was the farmers. Ultimately, though, when farmers get tagged, so does the public, and we certainly did. The same thing is now being recapitulated by the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization in Europe. See, the reason why Europe has a better food system than we do is because they resisted centralization for so long. And anybody who's taken a trip to Europe in the last 50 or 60 years can see the difference. Like when, for example, if you go south of Chicago, all the way to the Illinois-Kentucky border, you'll notice something very bizarre. It's nothing but farmland, but the farms are owned by industrial corporations. The same thing is true when you go to Iowa. The same thing is true when you go to Nebraska. Same thing is true in Arkansas. There's very few farmers really left. And I always like to tell the story, about the 1968 election, that if you looked back then at the USDA at that time had 88,000 people in it for the bureaucracy, and there was about 3 million farmers. Today, there's, I think, 3.8 million people in the USDA, and there's only about 800,000 farmers. So you're talking literally in one human lifetime that it's been completely flipped. And what you'll notice with anything, when administrators dominate the producers, that should make you start thinking about Atlas Shrugged, because that's exactly what's going on. And the same thing that happened to us in food actually happened in medicine. The flip of the switch there was in 1986 when Harvard came out with the idea of using CPT codes. And what happened at that time? Administrators and hospitals went up and doctors' powers went down. And if you actually look at who gets paid most of the money now, it's actually administrators and not the doctors. So centralization is everywhere you look. But you know what the big problem is, at least in my view, is that you can tell people this information. They don't do their own homework. They don't read. I mean, it's one of my big things with my own tribe. I'm like, from this coding thing. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it plays to the point you're asking me. From the Harvard 1986 CPT stuff, when they decided they wanted to centralize medicine, what was the effect? Where did it end? It ended in 2008, 2009 with Obamacare. And most people don't understand really what the purpose of Obamacare was. Obamacare was to take doctors' time and make it smaller for patients. In other words, you had to see 50, 60 patients a day so that you couldn't read. And if you couldn't read and stay up on the literature, that meant that you really had no control of science. Then they came up with another idea called evidence-based medicine, which is basically we're going to upload in your brain what we want you to know. We did it in medical school through the curriculum. We did it in residency the same way. And when you're out, we're going to do it to you again. And the goal of Obamacare was to limit doctors' time. So if you really wanted to be a true doctor to your patients, you actually had to cut fun out in your life and you had to cut your family life down. That's the only way for you to stay up on the literature. So it was basically a way to cut your time. In your business and farming, that's what regulations do. They actually take you away from being a producer. That's actually how things become centralized. And people don't realize that deregulation doesn't allow things to be captured. That's how the CDC, the FDA, the USDA, you name any of the bureaucracies that are present in the United States, they're all regulatory captured. And at the same time, the industrial military complex, how did they enforce all of these things? It was very simple. They captured the executive branch first. That's what they did with Kruse and Truman. And then they captured the legislative branch. And they did that really after they killed JFK, because they basically had made everybody aware on Capitol Hill that they would go to that length to control the paradigm in power. And then they followed it up by killing Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's dad in 68. So it didn't stop. And then, people still think, I got into a very interesting argument with a big Bitcoiner this year in a Clubhouse room 6 months ago. And I said, look, they're going to try to kill Trump. And everybody's like, no, they're not going to do that. That game plan went out in the 60s and 70s. I said, I don't think you really understand what's going on here. All through the lawfare, what is lawfare about, both for Trump and for Bobby Kennedy and Nicole Shanahan? It's the same thing as Obamacare was, my friend. It's about taking you away from being productive. Like, you can't be a productive politician if you're in fucking court fighting the paradigm in power. But the problem is a lot of people don't see what you and I are talking about now. Like, I always tell people, the handwriting is right there, but can you read what's out there? And I tell people the reason why they can't read is because their melanin sheets between their five senses is degraded by design so that you don't see the truth. And then when the paradigm tells you, oh, this is conspiracy theory, Jack Kruse and people of his ilk are not here to tell you the truth. Here's why I'm a problem for the paradigm. I know fucking history better than just about anybody. I also know what's happened in medicine. I know what's happened in other industries. I've actually got into arguments with Bobby Kennedy that I don't think what him and Nicole stand for goes even far enough. I think you need constitutional protections. I don't think suing people is going to solve anything. And the irony for me for this is I told him this to his face when him, I, and Rick Rubin did our podcast together. And, he kind of chuckled. This is before he got taken out of the race by lawfare. In other words, exactly what I warned him of happened to him. So I guess I would tell you, because Bobby is kind of in my age group, he's a little bit older than me. I'm just going to tell you that what makes me different than everybody else is, remember, I'm a doctor and I'm a good diagnostician. I would say Bobby is a politician. I think he's good, but I don't think he's as good as he could be. And the reason why is he's allowed himself to believe that the legal profession can somehow save him, and they can't. Just as I try to tell you that centralized medicine can no longer save your son from stage 4 cancer. You're never going to get the message that I gave to you on the podcast before, because they're doing all their best to make sure that your son never gets a tan and relies on the drugs, to do it. And let me explain to you how these two worlds collide. And this will probably truly mind blow for you, let me show you just how bad the system is and how it ties to your son and this food story. In 1989, the FDA was petitioned by companies, specifically the big food companies that you're familiar with in the Midwest, to put artificial sweeteners in certain foods. The FDA initially only allowed them to do that in certain places. What was the artificial sweetener that you probably remember? First it was saccharin, then it came to be Splenda. Splenda is known as sucralose. Here's one of the things that the food scientists that used to work for big tobacco, who are now in the food industry, found. It stimulates GLP-1. GLP-1, for those of you who don't know, that is a system in the body that deals with satiety, appetite, things like that. Okay? Now remember the year I just told you, 1989. Why do all of you know about GLP-1 now? It's because Big Pharma now has Ozempic, which is a GLP-1 blocker. So what did Big Pharma, Big Food, and Big Tobacco all conspire to do in the 80s and 90s? Stimulate your appetite, make you as fat as you possibly could, put all this in every food stuff they could, because they knew they had GLP-1 drugs coming out. So if you remember the story that I've told on multiple podcasts, probably the one that was the best, which was Daniel Prince's podcast, a dude from Europe. Why was I talking to him about this? Because of the interest that you have. You've already been captured in Arkansas. He's getting ready to be captured in Europe, in the food industry. I told him they banned my TED Talk in 2010, 2011, because what was I warning him about with the leptin melanocortin pathway? That if you use light, water, and magnetism, and you use melanin specifically, that you actually would reverse the GLP-1 problem. You wouldn't have any need for drugs. That's the reason why Big Pharma shelved the leptin trials, because they knew that the GLP-1 antagonists were coming. That's Wegovy, Ozempic, and all the bullshit that you hear, the Kim Kardashians and everybody else, like Ricky Gervais and all of them using now. Now it's become the number one drug for obesity in the United States and in Europe. But remember, they put the food stuff in the industrial complex after they captured, the wheat industry. So just think about what it's in. And what did the FDA do during this whole time? To prove Bobby's point about regulatory capture, the FDA then expanded the use of sucralose in everything else. So what were they doing? They were creating a market for a future issue. That is exactly what went on. And the problem is, it was really easy for me to make the diagnosis on, because I had the time. But why did I have the time? I had to stop putting screws and rods in people's backs. I had to stop taking vacations with my family. I actually had to go and read all this stuff. Did I personally pay a price for all that? Did my kids pay a price for that? Yeah, they did. But who's benefiting from it now? You are. Your audience is. But the problem is, what infuriates me? Is when I do podcasts, people don't show up. They don't listen. They don't do the things that they need to do. And just, excuse me for being a little bit pissed off. I hate when people tell me that there's not doctors out there working on your behalf, because there is. You know what the problem is? Take the fucking iPad earphones out of your ear, and how about listening to the truth? Okay? The truth is discoverable. Okay? If you do the hard work of reading the literature, putting the story together, and then telling people it's here. I don't want you to believe what I'm telling you. I really don't. But I want you to see it for yourself and understand why this system is gamed against you, and realize that it goes all the way back to when General Kruse found out that if we can control the science, we can control a lot. And when you understand truly what the military is about, it's about the money. And that was the case. General Kruse realized that war was a great business for the United States, got us out of the Depression. Nothing else that FDR did really worked, but getting into World War II was the best gig to solve the Depression, because it stimulated spending, and then spending led to building an economy. And remember, we destroyed Europe and Russia in the war over there because it was fought on their land. The only place that got destroyed in our country was really Pearl Harbor. And that was pretty easy to fix. Okay. We've never had a major war, on our own land, unless you consider, the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, a war. It didn't really destroy anything. It was more of a social deconstruction than anything else. And I think the problem now that I want people to see is that food, centralized medicine is lawfare against your time. And that's really the cause of your son's cancer. And you need to actually wade through the bullshit to see that. And if I can get you to understand the basics of how biology works, this is the beautiful thing for all patients. If you embrace nature, nature will embrace you back. She will give you the health that you need. You will cut your umbilical cord needs for health insurance, for the belief that you need drugs. Nobody has a pharmaceutical deficiency in this country. And I will tell you that I have a general distrust for all politicians. And in Bukele here in El Salvador, remember, who did I bring this message to first? It was him. And he said, I think this is a good idea. He asked me to write a constitutional amendment, and I did. And then when I met Bobby Kennedy, I told Bobby Kennedy what was going on behind the scenes. He had no idea. And then I also told Bobby Kennedy what was going on with the COVID jab when he didn't know about SV40 and the DNA plasmids. And I linked it back to what was going on with his father and his uncle. And because Bobby's really good about Fort Detrick on, he wasn't really good Fort Detrick before. And I shared that with him, and that's when he said to me, can I get a copy of that law? And then what magically happened? He started talking about chronic disease. He started talking about making America healthy again. He started talking about mitochondria. When's the last time you ever heard that come out of his mouth? Well, here's the good thing. Because I sacrificed some of the time in my 20 years to learn the things that I'm sharing with you right now, I'm telling you that you can get the world to change and bend at the knee when you do things correctly. And no, it's not always going to be shits and giggles. It's not always going to be interesting. You might even have to go to another country to find safe harbor, kind of like the colonists did from the king. People have actually said to me, well, it's really great. You live in exile and this and that. I said, well, didn't Thomas Jefferson do the same thing? I mean, last time I checked, he didn't write the fucking Declaration of Independence in England. He did it in the United States. So, again, history has lessons for us, but can you read? Are you listening to what I'm really saying to you, my friend? History always repeats. Now, it doesn't always repeat it exactly, but it rhymes. And what I'm telling you in this story is you can see the rhyme. You start to see really how centralization starts off with, what you think is an innocuous, simple little thing, but then it leads to massive collateral effects, which is kind of what's got the United States in the problems that it's in. And the thing is, for us to unwind it, it really is we the people. We the people have way more power than you think, and we need to make them bend. I mean, I try to tell people this all the time, that the Constitution was set forth by the people, as well as the Declaration of Independence, to tell the government this is what bullshit we'll accept, and this is what bullshit we won't. And I will tell you, since those founding documents have been placed in there, the government has been deriding and weakening those documents every single time. And I will tell you, it's me and you who've allowed that to happen, and our ancestors, and probably future. Well, I mean, you can see it now. People are like, hey, I don't know if you even heard the podcast that I did with a fireman who got pissed off when I told him about 9/11, and I went off on him. I was like, dude, I'm really sorry, that you don't like what my opinion is, but here's the bottom line. If you think people have to worry about 3 jobs, their kids, and this and that, while their freedom's taken away, how about you go look at what just went down in Venezuela with Maduro, where he was going to get voted out and he closed the polls. And why couldn't they do anything about it? Because he didn't have guns. They had sticks when the military had guns. Well, what the fuck does Kamala tell you she's going to do? Every time there's a school shooting, we're going to take your guns away. There's a reason they're going to do that because, I mean, every time in history, how does a authoritarian or totalitarian system take foothold? You have to disarm the people. That's what's going on. This is the same story in food, except now told a different way. And it's amazing to me that 55% of the American population thinks it's a really good idea to screw with the First and Second Amendment, because it's not. And I got news for you. When you get to the point in a country where the majority are idiots that think that is a good idea, then I think you need to do something pretty radical. And I'm glad to see some of the patriots in the United States beginning to push back and fight back. But dude, we're in the 8th or 9th inning of this game. These guys that are in D.C., they are the biggest criminals in the history of the United States. Like King George in 1774, dude, he's like your buddy compared to these assholes in D.C. And you need to realize, not only are they stealing your health and your wealth, but they're stealing your time. They're taking your time away. They're taking the time of your children away and your future grandchildren that are not even born. You are going to be slaves on their economic farm. They're going to take you right back to feudalism and medievalism if you allow them to do it. And yes, it did start with food. It's continued on in medicine. The next thing that they're going to go after the guns, is going to be your money. This is the reason why they're fighting tooth and nail about, Bitcoin versus fiat. People don't even know. Like I asked general people who listen to my podcast, I said, everybody knows AML, KYC, that what they stand for, anti-money laundering and know your customer. You know what I ask people? And I'm always stunned. Why do they call it money laundering? Do you know? No, most people don't. So the story that I told a couple of people on other podcasts about, the Jewish mob from Cleveland and DC, they used to use laundromats where their cash was. So they created a pile of money. That's how they learned to launder money. The guy that did that was Mo Dalitz. Do you know eventually what Mo Dalitz did when he left,
Las
Cleveland
Vegas.
and Detroit? Do you know what he became? Las Vegas.
Las Vegas.
And when then the government, the CIA get involved, they couldn't believe how strong and powerful they were. And they did it without using violence. They were like, we're interested in this. Why? Because they started to realize they could do the same thing except on a nation level state. And the mob was extremely effective at doing this in local jurisdictions. And then they got to a state jurisdiction. That's Vegas. Mo Dalitz basically ran Las Vegas in the 50s and 60s. And when the revolution happened in Cuba, the Italian mob, which was running all the casinos there, they got taken to the woodshed. What's the first thing they did? They went to go talk to Mo Dalitz about Vegas. And they said, hey, let's sit down and have a discussion. So when you realize how these centralizing entities came together, and you realize that the government was in on this as well, you begin to look at the 1950s and the 1960s, American history. This is American history, my friend, that you and your son was designed never to learn, because they don't want you to know what happened in the United States from 1945 to 2024. Because if you really knew what was going on, you'd begin to see that all the things that the founding fathers warned us about in the Constitution, the reason why the First and Second Amendment are what they are, the reason why the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, is what it is absolutely being watered down for the last 75 years. And it's being done by the industrial military complex. They're the shadow government that really runs the United States. They're the ones that are behind the uniparty. Like if you want to do Wizard of Oz, they're the dude behind the curtain. And the problem is, it's really hard for a guy from Arkansas who's a farmer to believe that the people you grow up listening to Bruce Springsteen are the guys who are really bad. It's not the guys they told you to believe that are bad. And the interesting part of this story that I ask people to go back and look at, what did Thomas Jefferson really warn you about with the First and Second Amendment? He said it's the people in government. That means your government, not someone else's government. The people who run you are the real big problems. That's where all the ideas came from in our founding documents. And what was the First Amendment? Why was it freedom of the press? Because if you censor anybody, you lose your feedback loop to point out the bad things the government's doing. That's effectively what the industrial military complex did from World War II all the way through. They realized they could use the military. For those of you who are not paying attention to any of this history lesson I'm giving you, Church Commission. Church was a senator or a congressman from Kentucky. In 1975, after all the nonsense that went on with JFK's assassination, he finally asked the CIA, who works for you? That's when we found out that Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather were working for the CIA the day that JFK got shot. We found out there was 400 people in the media at that time that were working on behalf of your government to hide the truth from us. And guess what? That program only got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's that now it's blatantly obvious, but you know what? Y'all all act like what I'm saying is heresy. And it's not, because you don't know the history. You don't read the blogs. You don't listen to what I'm trying to tell you. Because most of the young people out there, they're nihilistic and apathetic. They can't fathom that there's a plan out there by the people that are in power in Washington, D.C. to chop your legs out. Why? Because when you're sick and you eat shitty food, you're easier to control. That really is the story. That's the reason why they centralize everything. It's the reason why they're centralizing water now. It's the reason why they centralized the fish in the Hudson River. Why? You remember that song, America the Beautiful? Remember it talks about Purple Mountain's majesty and all the things that we have in our country? The government has allowed corporations to centralize the fish in the Hudson River, the oysters in Hudson Bay, the water that we drink, to privatize it. This is stuff that is our inalienable right, but what have they done? They did the same thing in your business. They industrialized food production to take it out of the hands of the farmers. Why? Because they couldn't control it. And if they couldn't control it, then they couldn't use food as a means of controlling us. That's exactly what the food pyramid of 1973 and 74 really is about. And I'm about sick and tired of these food gurus that try to tell you all this bullshit and say, look, the pyramid's wrong. Of course it's wrong, but you need to know why it's wrong. And if you don't know why it's wrong, you're not going to listen to any narrative about, why eating meat should be at the top or eating seafood should be at the top. The reason should be obvious, because it dumbs you down so that you take a whole bunch of pills and, you spend more on pharmaceuticals than you do on food. People just don't get it. They don't see how all the pieces fit. And yeah, I'm that guy. I'm that guy that is really pissed off. I'm pissed off at everybody. Why? Because to me, it's blatantly obvious what's going on. And it's amazing to me that it took, 2016 through 2024 to see what they did to Trump and to see what they did to us during COVID to realize, dude, this is a compliance test to see just how far they can push us. That's where we are right now. We are literally, 2 months away from an election. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
And that election is basically an election where we're going to step into being controlled by a person like Maduro, Idi Amin, Mao Zedong, or, Maduro. I mean, that's what Kamala Harris and Walz are about. They're about complete centralization of the system. And here's the irony. They're not even making any bones about it. Have you noticed that all the stupid Republicans on Twitter, what are they saying? Well, she hasn't even had one discussion with the media and this and that. Why should she? She already fucking owns the media. Think about it. And that's what drives me crazy. They say stupid shit because it tells you they haven't made the diagnosis yet. The steel is in, my friend. It's there. You are getting very, very close to 1774 if y'all don't wake up. There's a reason Uncle Jack has got the Pacific Ocean behind me. That's way nicer than California. Okay, there's a reason. Why? Because I don't trust the rest of you in the United States. The 55% of you who think it's cool to do Netflix, Starbucks, and worry about your 3 jobs to pay your bills, as that famous fireman said to me in a podcast before I lit him up. Look, this is about your freedom is at risk. Okay? It's at risk. And let me just tell you something. You have to spill blood to keep your freedom. You don't believe me? If you don't want to go back and look at the Civil War, you don't want to go back and look at the American Revolution, just take a look at what's going on in Venezuela right now. Those people are dying on the streets to keep the polls open. That's what was happening. And you know what? I'm sorry if you want to talk about food, but food is a fucking losing story. But there are so many bigger fish to fry. They keep hoping we talk about food. You know why? Because they fought that battle and they won in 1973 and 74. The food pyramid has done its job in the United States. It's dumbed down plenty. And they've continued to add to it. I told you the story about sucralose. Well, we're past that. Yeah. We haven't even got to the MK Ultra stuff and how they use light to do it.
Yeah, you've sold me on the food not being the top. That's not even remotely my point. I want to understand that agriculture from an economic standpoint, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like we're captured in Arkansas, right? Bill Gates is the largest landowner in the state, and so I'm interested in this approach from El Salvador and Bukele from how are we keeping this to happen where y'all are, and what is the implications of, say, his coffee plantation? I think that's so cool. How are we using it from an economic standpoint, not the nutrition side?
I would just tell you, I think where Bukele is right now is where the United States was in 1803. They're sitting on a landmass here in Central America, and believe it or not, these are smart people, but they didn't even know what I told them. I told them a year and a half ago at a meeting, I said, do you guys know why Iceland has more groundwater than anybody else? It's because volcanoes create groundwater. They push the water from deep in the earth up. I said, that means that El Salvador has to have a ton of it. And the funniest part of the story is when I met the president, he told me he had bought a coffee plantation and everybody advised him not to buy it because it had no water on it. And I said, I promise you, there's tons of water. You know what the issue is? You haven't drilled deep enough. You're going to need like oil rigs to get down, but I guarantee you there's more water under El Salvador than there is anywhere else. Why? Because it sits on the ring of fire and we have active volcanoes in this country. Right out my front, right out here, you can see the volcano that erupted 100 years ago in San Salvador. There's still black lava on the opposite side of the volcano that hasn't been touched by any vegetation yet. That's how recent it is. So, long story short, I went to a couple places where the groundwater comes up to the surface, much closer to the surface than it does where President Bukele owns the thing, and I sent the water off to be tested. And it turned out it's deuterium depleted. What did that tell me? It told me that this was the groundwater from the volcanoes and that it's definitely under the ground. The country just is poor that it doesn't have the technology to get out. It's the same story I just told you about Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark. They're like, dude, there's water down there, but we don't know how to get it. But if we get it, we're going to turn this into the biggest farm in the world. Well, now Bukele knows the same thing that Jefferson knows. So your question to me is, what's he going to do with that? Well, we're going to find out. Okay, because that's where we are right now. And the first project, what's the name of Bukele's coffee, since you're the one who brought it up? The Bean of Fire. Think about the story I just told you. He's like, well, now I got water, and it turns out it's deuterium depleted water, so that means I get 40% higher yields on my production. So, yeah, this could be a really big story for El Salvador. But the problem I have is I don't think that matters. When your freedom is getting ready to be taken away in the United States, what we're doing down here, it's just a shadow cast of previous history in the United States. We're way past that. You need to focus more on, you're getting ready to become a communist country in the United States. And you all need to do something about it. I mean, there's no bones about it. You need to realize that every aspect of what's going on in the United States, like opening the border, that is the army that's invading you. They are looking to replace you. Like, to not even to be even further. I don't know if I would call this hyperbolic or inflammatory. Probably some of your audience will be. I'm going to tell you a story that most people don't know. Remember the story I told you about the Jewish mob and where money laundering came from laundromats? Okay. So when you start to see a criminal element, the first thing you should look at is piles of money gone missing. So you probably, if you've not been brain dead, you've probably noticed that there's these big reports that the Pentagon and the Treasury are missing trillions of dollars and nobody knows where they went. So I'm going to tell you a story that should really open your eyes. In, I think it was the mid 80s to the mid 90s, an accountant from Michigan State University started to look at the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, all the things they would put out. And this guy found out that just from looking at the stuff the government put out, that there was $21 trillion missing. Then that has been extrapolated out by other accountants, and these are forensic accounts. Now the pile of money is believed to be $45 trillion to $145 trillion that nobody can account for. Remember, they're worried about me and you spending $600 on a sofa, but they can't account for this money. So what am I going to tell you that money is? That is the money that has been laundered by the industrial military complex to run their games in Afghanistan. The reason why we spent $20 trillion over there in 20 years is because they basically stole the money from the people to be able to do that. And they rehypothecated it over a period of time. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. So anytime the government comes up with an idea that actually sounds too good to be true, so I don't know how old you are, but you'll probably remember these two things happen in unison. Everybody was sick of Jimmy Carter. He got voted out, and all of a sudden Reagan comes in. And what is the first couple of things Reagan does? First thing he does, he hires Tony Fauci. Second thing he does, he decides to deregulate retirement programs, and he creates a program called an IRA, okay, or a SEP IRA. What does that do? He's saying that you can put money in and get a tax break for retirement accounts, okay, and build this up. Sounds great, doesn't it? It's a beautiful program. Nobody can argue with it. In fact, at the time, the Democrats and the Republicans at that time had zero problems with it. And then they expanded it. So guess what has been going on in the retirement program now? That money is not all accounted for. In fact, same accountant from Michigan State University has seen that there's a shortfall in the Treasury. The other pile of money that was created in the 60s, that was the Entitlement Act from LBJ. Remember, that's Social Security. Social Security doesn't have it either. Do you understand where the industrial military complex has been stealing from the people? This is with non-appropriated money through the CBO. In other words, it's not the money that's on the stuff they print. It's where all this money goes vanish. So now let's talk about a big connection. What else happened during Reagan's administration that you may not know is tied to this whole story? How did they get the idea to do the IRA program for retirement? Remember the Iran-Contra stories? Remember about running guns to Noriega down? Well, Oliver North kind of blew that whole thing up and Reagan got popped. But what was the lesson that the government learned there? The industrial military complex, again, that if you use non-appropriated money, this dark money could be used to fund dark projects. So what did the government decide to do? Why couldn't we do the same thing if we get people to donate money out of their paycheck, put it in an IRA, and then we could somehow steal it over a period of time to use it to fund military conquests? And then literally in the 90s and 2000s, you have forensic accountants going, something's not adding up about pensions, IRAs, and SEP IRAs. So while you've been working to fund your own retirement, guess what I'm telling you is going on? the biggest money laundering operation in the world. If you really want to know what Ukraine's about, it's about protecting the bioweapons lab and the money laundering that's been going on in the industrial military complex. That's the real story. And guess what? There's a reason they're fighting. There's a reason they're fighting Bitcoin. Now I'm going to tell you what the reason is. So when you steal trillions of dollars from we the people, right? You begin to realize the story that's happening here. It's very much like Mo Dalitz, Bugsy, and the mob in Vegas. In other words, the casino always wins, right? The house always wins. So if you took all this money and you spent, I don't know, say 5 trillion in Vietnam and say 20 trillion in Afghanistan, and you're running military bases all over the world and you're spending money like crazy, eventually, to make everything account properly, you're going to have to pay some of that off, especially when boomers who put the most money into retirement accounts start to retire, right? So how do you taper a Ponzi scheme? Well, there's one way to do it. I mean, you saw how Bernie Madoff failed, okay? He failed miserably, and he got busted. But how could you do it if you controlled industrial level military power? Do you have to pay off people that are dead?
Nope.
So you want to know what COVID really was about, my friend? That's how you taper a Ponzi scheme. And you just make sure that you take out the right people. You make sure that the ones that are due the most money out of the system. So think about who's been getting killed. Old people and people that are in the mid part of their life that are very productive. These are people that's hugely beneficial to make up the shortfalls of what you stole. See, the reason Bernie Madoff got popped is because guys that used to own the Mets, the New York Mets, they started asking for their money back. And when you ask for your money back and you're running a Ponzi scheme, the whole thing collapses on itself. Well, why has the federal government never accounted for the Fed, never accounted for the Treasury, never accounted for the Pentagon's budgets? Are you beginning to see another story develop in front of your eyes that sounds very, very similar to what happened with Bernie Madoff? See, most people in the United States, especially a guy like you in Arkansas, you don't think Bernie Madoff has anything to do with you. But guess what? It actually has everything to do with you, because they've been stealing from you from the time you started putting money into your retirement account. And you thought it was a good gig to get a match. Well, I got news for you. That money ain't there. And we know it's not there, because somebody's been using our money as a piggy bank. And there's only one way to fix that problem. You're at the point now, you either print the money or you actually get rid of the people that are due the money. And guess what they're doing? They're doing a little bit of both. But the problem is they're at the point in the history of the United States where they can't print enough to make off the shortfall. Why? If they do that, you get hyperinflation. And guess what? They get taken out just like the Germans did in World War I. That's exactly what happened in the Weimar Republic. That's not going to suit the industrial military complex. They're like, we're not going out under our own weight. So what do? They actually take out the people that are owed the most money in the Ponzi that they stole from, and then they replace them. So you want to know why your border's open now? They're getting new suckers into the casino. Because they know the old suckers who rolled their sleeves up, they're going to have a problem over the next 20, 30 years. That's really what's going on. Okay? And no, you can say this is hyperbole and this and that and the other thing. But trust me, dude, I'm the dude that has the goods. I know exactly how the project started, where it went, and it started way, way back with General Kruse, and it showed up with Alton Ochsner, showed up with the polio vaccine, and it should not shock you in the least that Jonas Salk, who never got a Nobel Prize because of SV40 and his jabs, all of a sudden now we find out Pfizer and Moderna have the same shit in their jabs.
One thing. So, yeah, you threw a lot at me right there. Do you know of anything to overcome SV40? I asked Dr. Makis this.
Right here.
And
right here. No, that's it. You got to live inside the tropics. I've actually already told people the truth. The problem is they don't accept what I'm telling them. And the reason they don't accept it is because they don't understand the biophysics of the argument. Here's the way it works. Everybody in Big Pharma tells you that RNA and DNA is the key genome to worry about. It turns out it's not. It's the mitochondrial genome that controls how active the nuclear genome is. So how do you keep the nuclear genome quiet when it's got SV40 and frameshift mutations in it from the jab? There's only one way to do it. Your redox has to be high round the clock. So I told you this with your son. If you already have a stage 4 cancer, you have no business living in Arkansas. And no, I don't care if that's an inconvenient truth, because it's the truth. And the thing is, I don't run away from the truth. Okay? So if you complied, this is like a zero order for me. You have no other option. Okay? That's the best option you have. If you decide to live at high latitude and took the jab, you're making a very critical error, because what are you doing? You're shuffling the casino deck. It's much more likely you're going to develop a problem down the road. And guess what? That's exactly what tapering the Ponzi scheme is all about. They knew it. And they want to, they may not catch you on the first round, the second round, but my friend, all you have to do is get on Twitter and see all these people, like some of the people that supported getting the jab, they're getting taken out. In fact, I just saw yesterday, one of the main supporters of Kamala Harris and Biden, the last election, just died. And then I found out his wife died from COVID complications right after it. And they kept posting pictures of them taking the shot. Look, this boomerang is extremely accurate. And remember, it's designed to be non-discriminate. It's designed to take out the people who are compliant, that absolutely have no clue what I just told you about this giant Ponzi scheme. And that's the reason I've told people consistently on social media for 4 years that COVID was a compliance test for an economic reset that's coming. What's the economic reset? They have to hide the fact that they stole trillions of dollars from we the people to fund all the things that they've wanted to do the last 75 years. And if you don't think that the bullet through Trump's ear was a big message to those who decide they want to change the situation, let me explain this to you very, very clearly. The bullet through Trump's ear is just what Maduro did by closing the polls. It's no different. They want to make sure everybody who supports Bobby or Trump, remember, they used lawfare to get rid of Nicole and Bobby. What they didn't plan on was now Bobby and Nicole going all in with Trump. That is a big problem, because you know what? They're going to have to steal a lot more votes, because Kamala, I think even within the Democratic Party, people know that she's a bumbling idiot. And she's a complete Manchurian candidate for the true controllers of this. And those controllers are the industrial military complex. And even if Trump gets elected and he gets in, dude, I tell everybody, please go back and listen to Bukele's CPAC speech from February 22nd. And what he said, doesn't matter who the next president. If the next president doesn't make the right diagnosis and fix the problem, you're screwed anyway. If Trump doesn't come in and he doesn't give Bobby control of the things that need to be controlled, we have to dismantle this bureaucracy piece by piece. And I'm talking not a little here and there, like, Massey talks about from Kentucky, about changing 1%. No, dude, we need to close departments. We need to eliminate intelligence agencies. We need to do things that are going to make your friends in Arkansas go, wow. Yes, that's what needs to happen. And the thing is, if we want control back in the country, now is the time to do the big things. It's the same thing that happened in 1774, that the colonists argued amongst each other. Remember, there was no uniformity of our opinion back then. There was a lot of people who were still, tied to the crown. If you don't believe me, I mean, just think about Alexander Hamilton. Right now, the DNC, they had a play on this in New York about him, and they told you how great he is. Thomas Jefferson hated him because he basically used the Bank of England system in our system. Why? Because there was no Bitcoin then. And people forget, how did Alexander Hamilton get taken out? Do you know that the vice president of Thomas Jefferson shot him and killed him? Aaron Burr. Bro, that's what I'm trying to tell you. People don't know the history. And even back then, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Federalist Papers warned all of us that banks are the source of all evil. What is the the history lesson I'm giving you in this podcast, that story hasn't changed. It's, in fact, it's now right in front of your eyeballs. But you keep thinking Starbucks, Netflix, and, watching college football, Circus Maximus style is the way to go. Bro, I'm sorry. I don't have time for those idiots. I don't. That's the reason I'm here. If you want to know the reason I'm not in Arkansas with you, planting cotton and soybeans and all that, because I don't trust the people of Arkansas to make the right decision. Why am I not in Tennessee? Why am I not in Florida? Why am I not in Louisiana? The same reason Thomas Jefferson and James Madison weren't. They didn't trust the people in the UK to make the right decision for the people in the United States. So what did they do? They took their freedom. Yeah, just so we're clear, they didn't use diplomacy with King George. They fucking shot at him. And they told him, people who are farmers, who have no skill set, we are willing to die. Nobody, including Napoleon, thought we were going to win that war. But guess what? The reason they're patriots, because they fought for what they believed in. They fought for their freedom. They put the pitchforks down, put the cows away, told the wives to take care of the kids, and they went out and took what was theirs. And I'm telling you, we're at the same point. You just don't realize it yet. But you will soon, when they come for the last piece, which is your money. And it's coming, brother. And I'm sorry, you don't want to know. Everything centralized is about money. That's where it comes down. That's where farming comes in. That's where the food problem comes in. That's where decentralized health comes in. It's always about controlling people. And what they really want to do is send us back to the dark ages. They want medievalism and feudalism, where there's one massa and everybody's out in the field doing what they got to do. Like, people don't even realize that the hardcore racists that live in Arkansas right now don't even realize who their master is anymore. They have no freaking clue that they are the slaves on the plantation. You don't have to have black skin anymore to be the slave on the plantation. Everybody that has skin is a slave. You don't believe me? Look at the debt. It's $35 trillion. Divide that by 360 million. You know what that tells me? You and your son owe the government about $168,000. That's what the cost of a passport is in the United States. Dude, you're already a slave and you don't know you're a slave. And that is exactly what they want. They don't want you to have a clue. But guess what? This is third grade math, my friend. This ain't a hard thing to figure out. I can tell you, for a neurosurgeon, this is one of the easiest diagnoses I've ever made. But it's amazing to me how many people I got to tell this story to, and then they tell me I'm the one with the tinfoil hat. Well, I got news for you. I'm the one sitting down talking to Bukele, talking to Bobby Kennedy, talking to Nicole Shanahan. What are you doing? What are you doing? You're sitting home drinking coffee. Well, I got news for you. I made the accurate diagnosis. It's time that some of you wake up. It's time for you to get the message. That's the story of November 5th. I think it's the last chance that you're going to have to give freedom back to your son. And if it doesn't go your way, dude, you stay in Arkansas, good luck.
All right, got one question as we wrap up. In the Tucker Carlson Bukele interview, Bukele was asked how he cleaned up the country, right? And he's like, I'll give you the real answer, or then the kind of the political answer. And he said the real answer was they prayed. It was a miracle, right? So how do you view the faith of the country and Bukele and how he has approached everything? And I think he is admired around the world based off of his beliefs and actions. So I just wanted your take on that.
Well, I think it's a little bit complicated. I'm going to tell you, because I want to shadow this with what happened in El Salvador and what's happening in the United States. Let me tell you what the key is. The shadow government in El Salvador was the MS-13 gang. And what did he do? When he came in, and this is the part of the history people don't get. Bukele is a religious guy. People don't know. He's a Palestinian by descent, but he's Christian by his religion. And his mother is Catholic. His father was Muslim, Palestinian. His father's dead now. Their parents instilled in them deep spirituality and for doing the right things. And most people are shocked to hear that in the beginning, Bukele was a communist, and then he realized that this was absolutely the wrong way to go, because you have to remember that Catholic Church is a lot like communism. They're a centralized entity, and they tell you kind of what to do. And most people who are religious don't like to hear this, but it's the truth. I always tell people, I can love my country and hate my government the same way I can love God and hate the church, because that's actually how I feel. And I think that underlying theme you need to understand about Bukele. And then I think the big thing is he made the accurate diagnosis. What's the first thing that Bukele did in El Salvador? He made Bitcoin legal tender. That was the first thing he did. 3 months later, then he went to the Constitution, and there's the exception regime is in there. Nobody's ever used it before. He used the exception regime in the Constitution to go after the gangs. And what did he do? He used surgical precision to get rid of them. He actually used their phones and their tattoos against them. Like, when I tell you, this was brilliant. And if you want to know a little bit about the truth and how he did it, because, he couldn't tell you the whole story. One of my good friends, his name is Dr. Ben Braddock. He's from Virginia. He writes for a periodical in the United States called IM 1776. You guys should have a read about that. He details exactly how Bukele got rid of his shadow government. So now let's fast forward before the Tucker Carlson interview. I'm at Bukele's brother's wedding on, I forget when it was. It was sometime in February. And President Bukele came up to him. We started chatting about how he changed the light bulbs for his brother's wedding. And he said, Jack, I'm going to CPAC in 5 days. And he goes, I really don't know what to say. And I said to him, just tell him the truth. So what did he do? He goes to CPAC and uses a patient sick in the ICU as the analogy. And he tells them about what he did in El Salvador. And he said, most of the people in my country didn't believe that a politician could come in and do the things that are right. He says, so the first thing I had to do is go back and give them freedom of money. He goes, we use American money, but we know the people in the United States are corrupt. So I had to give my people an insurance policy in case they use money to attack my people by devaluing the currency. So he gave them that. The second thing he did is he went after the gangs. Why? Because the gangs extorted the people in El Salvador. They were taking about $300 from every citizen every month. And, people in Arkansas may not think this is a big deal, but people in El Salvador only make $1,000 a month. So if somebody took 30% of your money right now in every place in Arkansas, you think people would have a problem with that? Well, this went on for 20 years, and people just got dumbed down to it. They were like, well, this is the system we live in, and the government's not going to help us. Literally, in 3 to 6 months, crime went from the worst in the world to like zero. Dude, I could walk around here right now with $20,000 in my hand going like this. Nothing happens. And I'm talking not just murder's gone down, everything's gone down. Nobody's stealing anything. You are safer here than any place in the world right now. Why? Because what did Bukele prove? He proved exactly what the DNC doesn't want you to know. That when you have 1% of the bad hombres doing all the crime and you put them away, crime goes away. Because most citizens do not want their lives tied up in crime and have to go to court and do this and do that. Put the bad guys in jail. Well, guess what? That's law and order was something actually that Trump tried to do the last time. You see now under the DNC and Biden, we've got people doing all kinds of crazy shit in the United States. So when I tell you that Bukele realized, he diagnosed the bad guys, and you don't know this about the bad guys because you probably haven't read Ben's book. The guys in MS-13 actually came from the Clinton administration. That's how they were created. And we sent them back here to El Salvador, and they created havoc here. And these people are satanic cultists. They do the craziest shit you could ever imagine. And the reason why Bukele sat down and prayed is because he knew that his plan through the exception regime was the last Hail Mary for El Salvador before all hell broke loose and the cartels and the criminals were taking over. And he knew that the people, meaning the military, the national police, everybody was at risk with this plan. Like, this was like playing poker and putting all your chips in. So what did the president do when he was faced with that? He made the diagnosis. He thought he was right. And then he decided to pray on it. Why? Because that's what his mom and dad told him is a smart thing to do. Pray for wisdom. Pray to see, am I making a mistake or not? I look at prayer in my world, like I told you before about going back and reading the literature. Literature is the truth. And here's the funny thing. In science, we have to get the truth by reading the literature. In religion, we believe it on blind faith. And what is blind faith really about? It's about the good and evil in people. And there are some people that are not redeemable. For a lot of people who are very religious, they may not believe that. But Bukele believed that about MS-13. And he said, can I take the rights of those people away because 99% of my people are good people? He's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that was correct. But he still prayed for wisdom from where he gains his faith. Like up there, that's Bukele's peer review literature. For me, what I do, my peer review literature is to cut through all the bullshit, have you focus in on the right things so that your son doesn't die of a stage 4 cancer. And my job is to tell you that. It's your job to have either blind faith to do it or not, or to listen to the people, that you've been educated to listen to. And that's where Bukele, to me, was at the Tucker Carlson interview. It's the reason why I think people in America, when they heard him say what he said, just like you did, you heard what you thought you heard. I think you need to understand the context of why the decision was made, because this was probably the biggest political decision that a leader can make for his country. He did not know if it was the right thing to do, but he summoned the best in him and he talked to a lot of people before he made the decision. And we are here now in 2024. We're now 6 years, like 5.5 years into his program. I can tell you, I came here 4 years ago. I came here before Bitcoin was legal tender. I came here before the exception rule went in. I actually stayed in a place down on that beach behind me where MS-13 was an epidemic. It was like a COVID enclave down there. And the bad hombres never did anything to the gringos. The reason why is because the gringos fed the people that they fed off of. So you need to realize that you were still safe here. Now, the federal government in the United States through the State Department tried to convince a lot of you people in Arkansas and everywhere else not to come down here and visit. I would tell you now, if you want to see what the United States looked like in 1801, 1802, and 1803, come take a look, because that's the Louisiana Purchase right behind you. That's what's really going on here. And it took the courage and the spirituality of the leader of El Salvador to return that back to his people. And that's the reason why when I do podcasts and I talk about Bukele, I tell people that he's like George Washington on steroids, because the colonists relied on George Washington's wisdom as well. George Washington was also a very spiritual guy. I mean, he prayed many, many, many times that he would be making the right decisions, for the colonists, for the guys that were farmers that put their pitchforks down and were given a musket. Many times they were outmanned in a big way. I mean, if you don't think that true leaders are going to get spiritual when they know they can put people in harm's way, then I think you don't understand leadership. I think it's the same role that a doctor has. I know that my patients back in the United States are under assault from the industrial healthcare complex. Just like, as you know, in Arkansas, as a guy involved in the food business, that being in the food business in the United States is really a losing game. Why? Because the system is so heavily weighted towards centralization. There's no way in which to fix your health anymore through food. Anybody who believes that, in my opinion, is a lost soul. And I think when you get a crack in the system like we have now with Bobby coming in with Nicole and her money into Trump, and Trump saying, no, we need to join forces, bury the hatchet and the things we don't agree with, but we need to take back our country. I think that kind of faith, the faith that Trump has in Bobby and the faith that Bobby has to have in Trump, is the same kind of faith that Kelly was talking about with Tucker. I don't think it's probably the kind of faith that everybody's really thought about, especially in the United States. And I think when you guys go to the polls, whether you early vote or you vote on election day on November 5th, I hope some of you pray, because I know you need it in a big way, especially when you're living in places where more people are being killed every day, like Chicago, LA, New York. You don't have to live this way. You're choosing to live this way because you're buying a lie. And you have to realize it's going to take a lot of patriots to stop the process that the industrial military complex has come on. And let me be very clear. United States doesn't become the United States again until we go after the Joint Chiefs of Staff, until we go after the CIA, until we go after the FBI. They all need to be enucleated. I'm going to leave you with this. Really remember why they killed JFK and Bobby Kennedy's dad. What did they want to do? They wanted to get rid of those industries. And in fact, I think JFK said in his speech, blow them to smithereens. And I can tell you that's when the CIA and the FBI joined forces with the Mossad and with the FBI, I should say the mafia, that was based in Cuba that had their casino stolen. That's when they all came up with the plan that no. The shadow government that we're all involved with here, we're not letting this go. That was the same moment that I think where El Salvador was in 2019. The difference is in the United States, it's been running a long time more than it's been running in El Salvador. But the people here, I think every American should actually take a trip to El Salvador before November 5th and talk to them. Ask them just one question. How's your life before and after the exception regime? Before your president decided to do what many people from the outside in, because they didn't understand the context, they would consider it the moves of a dictator. The difference is when you give money back to the people and freedom back to the people, you can't be called a dictator. Dictators will call you crazy, but that's exactly what he's done. And I've said to many people that I don't trust any politicians. That includes Bukele. But when I look at Bukele, what he's doing, he's returning things back to the people. That's very, very reminiscent of Thomas Jefferson. It's very reminiscent of George Washington. And because I am an American and I know our history really well, to see this going on, I feel this has been a pleasure for me to be in this country. I feel like I'm re-experiencing 1800 to 1803 again without the history books. I'm actually seeing what it's like for people to gain their freedom back. And the thing is, when I put Twitter on and see what you guys are going through in the United States, it sickens me because all of you have been made sick by the food, the light, the EMF, the policies for 70 years, so that your ability to reason and know what the truth is has gone away. You can't even make an accurate diagnosis. You are truly a frog in the pot. And right now, it's 211 degrees in the United States. You have one more month before you get to the boiling point. And remember what Bukele said. If you haven't watched his CPAC speech, he said, higher the temperature goes up, the harder it is for the frog to move out because his muscles don't work. That's exactly what's going on in the United States. He was the guy that realized that in El Salvador, and it played a big role for him making some of these big decisions. But that's what leaders have to do. And I think you as a voter also have to be a leader of your family. You have to be a leader for your son. Your son does not have the ability to make the best decisions for himself. You do. And you have to do that as his father. I mean, you decided to have him. He's defective for whatever reason it is, whether it's through the germline or Arkansas. It's almost immaterial what the reason is, but it's material now that he's alive and breathing that you need to do everything possible to help him. Children are the artificial intelligence that is our target. See, artificial intelligence in the technocracy has no target. Talk to anybody who's a transhumanist, ask them what the target of AI is. They'll never fucking answer the question. And I can tell you, the target of human intelligence is artificial. It's our children. Your son is not like your wife and is not like you. He's definitely an alien. And guess what? That is another, I guess you would call it acronym or analogy for what children really are. They are nature's artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence may grow up someday to actually really change the world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing with all of us, and appreciate you, and enjoy your retirement.
Yeah.
You've given me a lot to chew on.
It's good. All right. Take care.
Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.